In a February article in The Atlantic entitled "Workism is Making Americans Miserable," Derek Thompson writes, in his 1930 essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, the economist John Maynard Keynes predicted a 15-hour work week in the 21st century, creating the equivalent of a 5-day weekend. For the first time since his creation, man will be faced with his permanent problem, Keynes wrote: how to occupy the leisure. That hasn't exactly panned out. Instead, the article goes on to note that we are awash in what it calls workism. It is the belief that work is not only necessary to economic production, but also the centerpiece of one's identity and life's purpose, and the belief that any policy to promote human welfare must always encourage more work. Now think for a second. Those who profit from our comings and goings have certainly found a way to feed into our frenetic pace of life. Think of any number of mechanisms that track our activity for work. If you have diamond status with an airline, you had to fly a lot of miles to get that status. If you can stay in a hotel for weeks on end without ever paying a penny, you are gone for a long time to accrue all of those points. And it is mostly work, not leisure, that we use to accumulate our so-called status. I have read that the National Institutes of Health reports that 1 in 5 Americans is living with fatigue that is so severe that it interferes with daily normal life. I have been tempted at times to ask during this season, when the building has been wrapped in scaffolding, if before it comes down, couldn't we have a banner printed up and hung on our building on Walnut Street that read simply, "Come sit for an hour and do just one thing." Sunday mornings. I wonder if we'd have enough seats. Of course, some will say that's just life. That's reality. We've been dealt this reality, or we've dealt it for ourselves, and it isn't going anywhere. Pretending otherwise is foolish. It is a great way to fall behind. It's not changing. I'm sure that's the rationale, at least part of the time, but we also know that fatigue can lead to depression, irritability, and a generally negative outlook on life. This is no secret. So I wonder if perhaps this morning the words of the apostle strike your ear in quite the same way they do mine, as he writes to the Thessalonians, to us, "Do not be weary. And anyone who will not work should not eat." Surely women and men work just as hard then as they do now. I have to wonder if that doesn't sound just a little bit tone deaf to the life we live. And yet there are many people I know who are working very hard for long hours, who find themselves energized, happy, and enthusiastic about what they are doing. What do you suppose makes the difference? I'm reminded of a woman with whom I worked many years ago. Her name is Joan, who would regularly admonish me to take my day off. If she saw me in the church when I was supposed to be off, she wanted to know why. If I returned an email on Friday, she would reply saying, "That is all well and good, but I'm not even going to read what you have written me until tomorrow because Friday is supposed to be your day off." Well, Joan was my boss, and she worked more hours than I could count. So I asked her one time, "Joan, you wake up at 4:30 every morning so that you can be at the gym by 5, in the office by 6:30, ahead even of the building staff, and you don't go home until late in the evening, and yet you're worried about me burning out?" She replied, "I like it." Now first, she said, I want you to notice this. I always take my day off, Saturday, as a day of Sabbath. Second, and this is the part I remembered, I firmly believe that when you are doing work that you find deeply meaningful, work that brings you joy, you will not burn out. I've wondered through the years if she's right about that. From my own life, I certainly know there have been moments when I have worked late hours on something that I deemed to be important and gone home energized, if a bit tired. And I know as well there have been days when I have left exactly at 5 o'clock on the nose and been exhausted with the level of tedium with which I had dealt, leaving me straight up worn out. And I am certain that in this regard, ministry is no different from many of the careers that you yourselves occupy. When the work we are doing wears us down, it leads to burnout. And when the work we are doing gives us joy, we may well be tired, but we are not exhausted at our deepest level. Vocation is a word for the work that brings our labors into alignment with God's hopes. Maybe it's easier to think about work when our labors are living into God's dream. The word vocation derives from a Latin root, vocare. It means to call. If you think that calling is just for ministers, it is not. Calling is for all of us. It is the way that God calls us to work for God's goodwill in the world. God calls all of us to meaningful work in our lives. If we are very lucky, we get to do it for pay. But many of us find that the places where our work align with God's hope lie elsewhere. Here's an example. For many years, my father worked a job that he didn't like very much because it paid very well. But he would be the first to say that he didn't consider those years working in that job wasted. He always said the end was what justified the means. He said, sure, at times it was simply a job, but it enabled me to do that which gave me joy. I was able to take a lot of time off to be with my family and to provide the life that I wanted us to have. And so it was good work, even if it was at times a bit boring. Indeed, it reminds me of another friend of mine, a lawyer I knew many years ago, a big-shot malpractice attorney. And folks at the church that I served wanted her to get involved, so they asked her if she would join the hospitality committee. You know that's really important work, I hope. The hospitality work of the church, the work our deacons do. That cookie and cup of coffee is the hospitality of Jesus Christ. And when we go to the effort to put it out, we don't know how many folks who come will find that that is their only face-to-face conversation in a given day. I think Coffee hour might be one of the most important things we do as a church, and I hope you find ways to thank our deacons every time you see them for the labor of love they put into expressing the hospitality of Jesus Christ in this place. So we asked her to join the hospitality committee, and she immediately declined. She said, "I am not good at that. It is not my gift, and I would soon resent the work. But," she said, "I am very good at winning cases, and my clients need me, and as a result, I am paid a great deal. So I am very happy to share from my material wealth for the good of our congregation." As I thought about the words my dad said and the words this lawyer said, it made me think of this, that I can think of very few more reliable ways to be abjectly miserable than to try to live somebody else's calling. Discernment in our lives is the way that we seek that means by which God calls us to align our labors with God's hope for the world. And when that work brings us joy, it is so much easier to sustain. You know, the overwhelming evidence suggests that when labors have rewards, they are more easily sustained. When we see the value in what we are doing, whether it is for the purposes of laying out a spread of cookies and coffee, or helping a client, or healing the sick, or preaching the gospel, teaching a child, paying the tuition, when we see the reward for our labor, it is so much easier to sustain. Then work has meaning. Then work has the potential to give us joy. It is easier not to be weary. But Paul sure did give us an earful about work this morning, didn't he? You should know that this is not a political statement from Paul. He is not writing about the minimum wage or right to work laws. Paul is pragmatic to the core. You can be sure that this is about a particular problem. And yet, even knowing that, even attempting to reconstruct some context around Paul's words, it all does sound vaguely unchristian, doesn't it? Or maybe it even sounds explicitly unchristian. In the Christian faith, we don't equate one's ability to work with one's right to one's daily bread. And yet Paul says, if they will not work, let them not eat. That doesn't sound much like aligning our labors with God's hope, I don't think. Now, as is generally the case, Paul is addressing a very specific problem in the church in Thessalonica. And to understand it, we need a little bit of background. Now, throughout the pages of Scripture, there is a theme that is developed that God's work is always unfinished until one day when it is all said and done and the work of God is concluded. And that's a big day in the Bible. That's what we call the day of the Lord in the Bible. We read about it this morning from Luke's gospel narrative. It's when it all comes together and God's vision of creation and the reality of existence finally coincide to create God's shalom in the world. That's a big day. Turns out that some of the Thessalonian Christians were convinced, absolutely convinced, that this was going to happen right after lunch. Or perhaps right after breakfast, or while they were in the shower. They thought it was so imminent that they wanted to be ready for it, and so they quit working. They didn't want anything to distract them from that deeply spiritual moment of the day of the Lord when all of creation came to its culmination. And yet the day of the Lord didn't happen right after lunch or after breakfast or while they were in the shower. Day after day, it didn't happen. And with all of this non-working, they got bored. And because they were bored, they got to meddling. Since they didn't have anything else to do, they would spend their days as unofficial supervisors of others' work. There are few things in life as irritating as an unofficial supervisor who isn't going to do any work. So to them, Paul wrote, that is enough. There is work to be done. If you don't want to get on with it, fine, get out of it. Leave us alone. That's when work becomes unsustainable, isn't it? When it doesn't feel like it matters, when someone's just sitting back criticizing, there's not an end to justify the means. That's when work is unsustainable. But if we are using our time and our labors for the good of the world, then we can align our labors with God's hope. I'm reminded of a popular memo a while back. It read simply, Jesus is coming, look busy. Now, the simple truth is that Jesus is probably not coming back after lunch today. I'm not going to rule it out, but in this instance, past performance does seem to be a reliable indicator of future expectations. I just wouldn't count on it. And yet, throughout all of his writings, Paul seemed to do just that, to count on the imminent return of Jesus any day. And yet, even with that hope and that expectation of a Christ who was coming back any minute, he kept working. He admonished the others to keep working. Do not be weary in doing what is right, he said. Do not be weary in doing what is right, because that is the way that the work of God is done. Do not be weary. That's one of the reasons why I've never believed that our offerings for the church should be about what the church has done for us lately, but rather out of a deep and abiding knowledge that God is the one sustaining this whole endeavor, not us. Indeed, when it comes to the work of the church, God has already done all the heavy lifting. That's why there's a cross in our sanctuary, just in case we forget it from time to time. The work of God that we do is the way we contribute to the shalom of the world. Let me close with a story that I heard a while back on NPR about the adolescent fiction writer Matt de la Peña. He's a Newbery Award winner and a Caldecott Medal winner. He has made a career out of writing meaningful fiction for adolescents. And yet it is not always a foregone conclusion that that would be the case. He said in his household growing up, reading books was for the sensitive. And in his own words, if there was one thing a guy couldn't be in my machista Mexican family, it was sensitive. But he said it all changed when, in his sophomore year, a professor handed him a novel and asked him to read it. It didn't matter when, any time before he graduated would be fine, and to come back to her and to discuss what they had read together. And so he was given this novel, and he read it slowly at first, but then as he got deeper into it, he devoured the book. And as he finished the final paragraphs, the self-professed tough guy found himself blinking back tears. The novel was The Color Purple. And his professor said that what she loved best was that even in the harshest and ugliest of circumstances, there is still hope. He decided that was what he loved best. It was a moment of redemption with lifelong repercussions. The work of God, when we engage in it, is our contribution to the healing of the world. It is how we add our part to the shalom of God. And it's why we don't ever give up hope in this world, even while we wait for a world that is yet to come. Because we know that when our labors align with the hopes of God, our work makes all the difference. We will soon enter the season of hopeful waiting. And even then, perhaps especially then, the work we are doing now matters. As I said earlier, there's a theme in Scripture that God's work is really never finished, and that's true. It's there all over the pages of the Old Testament. So much so that there is a bit of old rabbinical wisdom that suggests that after the 6 days of creation, God intentionally left creation just a little bit undone so that we might be allowed to participate with God in creating something that brings about God's shalom. So do not be weary of doing what is right. Do not be weary of doing what is right.